Today we're going to be talking about or more Reconstruction, and we're going to pick up with the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, just to kind of wrap up that from where we left off yesterday. But to recap real quick, the Congress passed what was called the Tenure of Office Act to essentially get rid of Johnson. So they passed this act making it illegal for the president to fire a federal official or a military commander without Senate approval, which is not the case anymore, but became the case. He did not get along with Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, and so as a result, in 1868, he fires him. He felt like the law was unconstitutional, which essentially was, but he fired Stanton, and so Congress then proceeded with impeachment charges. And so the House will file impeachment charges against him for violating the law, and they will pass it, and he'll be officially impeached, which impeachment means that he's formally charged with a crime. Does not mean he's removed from office. Just means that he's charged with this crime. Now, after that point, remember your civics, it then goes to the Senate. The Senate has to then decide whether or not he gets impeached, or excuse me, if he gets removed from office. So after he's impeached, the Senate will have a vote, and it will come down to one vote, but he stays in office. But he's essentially rendered a lame duck anyway. He can't really do much more harm. The one guy who voted to keep him in at the end there decided to do that because he didn't want to set a bad precedent for just removing a president anytime he felt like they didn't get along with you. So Johnson is impeached, but he gets to stay in office until the rest of the term in 1969, but basically rendered useless for the rest of that time period. And all this takes place, all the trials and proceedings take place in 1868. Last little bit we're going to be covering is on this slide are the reforms under Grant. So the next president of the United States past Johnson, who's been kind of the president in waiting since the war ended, is Ulysses S. Grant. Very popular war general, the general who helped end the war for the Union. He's been waiting around to get the nomination. Now he's going to get the nomination in 1968 and will win fairly easily in this election. The Democrats picked a guy named Horatio Seymour at their convention. So Johnson was not picked by the Democrats to run for president. No one really cared for him. So in that election, 1868, Republicans turned to their war hero, U.S. Grant, with pretty much no political experience. So he has no political experience prior to this, kind of like Taylor was before a long time ago. Despite his popularity up north, he only won 300,000 more popular votes than the Democrats. So he only won 300,000 more popular votes than the Democrats in this election, even though he was widely popular as a general. The new votes that were created under the 15th Amendment, or the African Americans being allowed to vote now, helped him win the election. So because African Americans voted in this 1868 election, you see 500,000 African Americans give their vote to the Republican Party, which is going to be the case for decades. A lot of African Americans vote Republican for decades because it was the party that freed the slaves. It was the party of Lincoln. So in that election, because now you have a lot of emancipated slaves who now can vote in the 1968 election, they're going to vote for Grant, and that's going to push him over the edge. So thanks to them, he wins his term. It made Republicans now realize the voting rights of African Americans were very necessary to help protect their federal wishes and desires, and making sure that they were able to keep producing the kind of things they want to produce. So right whenever the transitions happen between Johnson and Grant, Congress is going to pass the last of the Reconstruction amendments with the 15th. 15th is pretty straightforward. Republicans in Congress acted as quickly to secure this before it was too late, and in 1969 it will be ratified as an amendment across the country. This will give voting rights to, well, it says you can't deny voting rights to any citizen based on their race, color, servitude, or whatever. So the point is that this document, the 15th Amendment, says that anybody can have the right to vote, regardless of race or previous servitude or whatever the case may be. So this, in theory, empowers African American males, at least, to vote. Now, whether or not it empowers females, that's up for controversy, and some women will fight against that for a while. But in the meantime, this is supposed to open up voting rights to all males, period, at the end, no matter what you are. And we're going to see how that's still going to be hindered on in the next several years. But in the meantime, at least, it does, for a Reconstruction period, give African Americans more permanent, secured rights to vote. And then finally, with Grant, you have the last Civil Rights Act that's going to be passed until the 1950s. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So this is in his second term, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This is the last of the major acts of Reconstruction. It guaranteed equal accommodations in public places like hotels, railroads, and theaters. The North and Republicans already saw the South, the states that had finished Reconstruction, start to develop Jim Crow laws that perpetuated segregation, or this idea of segregation. And so this act that was passed through Congress was supposed to guarantee equal accommodations in public places like railroads, theaters, hotels, and so forth. It also prohibited courts from excluding African Americans on juries. So this act was supposed to also allow African Americans to be able to serve on juries too and not be discriminated against there either. But it was poorly enforced, unfortunately, because moderate and radical Republicans had become frustrated with the unwilling South. So as time goes on, they pass these laws, but the South continues to dig their heels in. They don't want to make any kind of adjustments. They don't want to follow these laws, and so as a result, they don't really get enforced because the South keeps pushing back, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so they didn't want to lose white support up north, and so essentially, or the white vote up north, if they push it too hard. And so therefore, they just kind of, over time, abandon these issues. Plus, once Reconstruction ends, and we move away from all this, you're going to see the Supreme Court also not help out either by striking down some of these laws as well. So the laws that get passed, they seem great, they seem awesome, but the South doesn't want to follow them. The North has a hard time enforcing them over time, loses their interest in enforcing them because the South puts up such a fight, and so those laws never really enforced, which means African Americans continue to be oppressed and separated in society for the rest, not for the rest, but for a very long time. So that's the rest of the slide, and that kind of wraps up the majority of what Congressional Reconstruction was all about. We saw this map with the different districts. Now we're looking at Reconstruction in the South, discussing some of the things that take place in the South as a result of Reconstruction. All right, so during the second phase of Reconstruction, the Republican Party in the South reorganized and dominated the ex-Confederate governments. All those ex-Confederates weren't allowed to serve in the government. So basically you have these Southerners who were not Confederates, who are Unionists, will join the Republican Party, and they'll be the ones who dominate their governments during Reconstruction. Beginning in 1867, each Republican-controlled government had military protection until the state met its requirements. So the Republicans that were in charge had also military protection on top of that, so they wouldn't be harassed by Democrats and so on. Republican rule doesn't last long because once states were reconstructed and rejoined, slowly but surely the conservative Democrats win office by office, governors, state legislature, Senate, and so forth, and they'll eventually return to power. But during Reconstruction, Republicans dominate because those ex-Confederates are basically not allowed to join any kind of party affiliation, and so Republicans have a lot of influence during Reconstruction. But once the state's reconstructed, the state goes back in the Union, slowly but surely conservative Democrats regain their control, and which is what you see why the South is so problematic going forward with African Americans and so on at this point. All right, so the first thing we look at is the composition of the Reconstruction governments. The first thing on the slide is the composition of Reconstruction governments. In each Republican government, whites were the majority of the legislature, but there were some free men included as well as people from the North. So what you also see joining the Southern legislatures were freed men who could now have the right to citizenship and the right to vote. So actually you see African Americans get the right to vote and actually gain office. Also Northerners who came down to live in the South during Reconstruction also end up getting offices too. That brings us to two groups of people Southerners didn't like, which were scallywags and carpetbaggers. So on the screen you see scallywags and carpetbaggers. Scallywags were Southern Republicans or people from the South who lived in the South their whole life and became Republicans. They were kind of seen as traitors to the South and their ideas, and so if you were a Southerner who became a Republican, you were called a scallywag. Usually these guys were the former Whigs who were interested more in economic development than they were in all the racial issues and the sectionalism and so on. The other group, which you're probably more familiar with, are the carpetbaggers. These are the guys who came down from the North. So carpetbaggers were these people who came down from the North who were interested in coming to the South to set up businesses, to help make money with the South. They were missionaries trying to come and help the South out as well. Some were teachers. It all varied. But these guys who show up, they're there to try to start a new life and try to help the South out in some cases. Some were not there for that reason. Some were there to plunder. Some were there to take advantage of the situation, which they did. But it wasn't always the case. But carpetbaggers and scallywags are usually still a dirty word in the South because of those dirty Yankees coming down here. And then lastly, you have the African American legislators as well. Legislators, excuse me. Most African Americans who held office were educated property holders. So if any African Americans got office in Louisiana, Mississippi, wherever, they weren't just some random African American guy. They were guys who had education, they had property, which means they held some influence and some sway. In this time period, in Reconstruction, in Congress, you're actually going to see 2 African American senators. So the first 2 black senators take office during this time period, and over 12 African Americans will serve as representatives in Congress as well, which is a big step. Many more serve in state legislatures throughout. This caused a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of resentment and embitterment amongst the ex-Confederates because they're not going to be too happy about this, and once they get back power, those guys are not going to hold office any longer either. 2 of the most famous guys to serve in this time period to hold office for the first time, and you need to make sure you have these guys' names down, are Senator Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. So Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce are some of your first congressmen, African American congressmen to serve in this time period, and did a lot for African American rights and led them in this time period as well. So Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. And they're right here on the screen. I'll show you if you can't get it later on. It's also the only time that Louisiana had its black governor. We've only had one black governor. That was, if you remember his name from middle school, it's PBS Pinchback. He was actually made lieutenant governor, and then the other governor resigned, and so he had to fill in for the governorship for about a month. But for 1 month, we had a black governor in Louisiana, and haven't had one since then. There's been some recent talk if Kip Holden wins the lieutenant governorship, that'd be the first African American to win a statewide race like that since Reconstruction. So that'd be pretty significant to take place. Let's stop this video and we'll go to the next one.